The photographer kept adjusting his lens, positioning my son Daniel and his wife Ashley for what should have been our annual family portrait. I stood there watching, waiting for my turn to join them, when Ashley's voice cut through the studio, like ice. Actually, we'd prefer just the nuclear family in these shots. You understand, right, Helen? It's more intimate that way. Her smile was sugar-sweet, but her eyes were steel. Daniel didn't even look at me, just nodded along like a puppet on strings. That was the moment I realized I'd been building my entire legacy for people who saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience to be cropped out of their perfect picture. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What they didn't know was that every single thing they treasured, every comfort they enjoyed, every dollar in their bank account, flowed directly from a trust fund I controlled. And if they wanted to lock me out of their family, well, I was about to show them what being locked out really meant. My name is Helen Rosewood, and for 62 years, I've been the kind of woman people underestimate. You know the type: quiet, accommodating, always putting family first. I've spent the last 35 years of my life carefully building something extraordinary, not for myself, but for the family I thought would cherish me forever. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I was absolutely right about one. I was very, very good at making money. It all started when Daniel was just 7 years old. His father, my late husband Thomas, died suddenly in a construction accident, leaving me with a mortgage, a grieving child, and exactly $237 in our checking account. The life insurance barely covered the funeral expenses. I remember sitting at our kitchen table that first night as a widow, staring at bills I couldn't pay, wondering how I was going to keep our little house in Maple Grove. Most women in my situation would have moved back in with family or found a modest apartment somewhere cheaper. But I couldn't bear the thought of uprooting Daniel from the only home he'd ever known, not when he was already devastated by losing his father. So I did what desperate people do. I got creative. I started small, selling homemade preserves at the weekend farmers market. My grandmother's recipe for strawberry rhubarb jam was always a hit at church socials, so I figured it might earn a few extra dollars. Within 3 months, I was selling out every weekend. The money wasn't much, but it was enough to keep us afloat while I figured out my next move. That next move came when I met Eleanor Hartwell at the market. Eleanor was 93, sharp, as a tack, and owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Millbrook. She'd been buying my preserves every weekend, and one Saturday morning she made me an offer that changed everything. "Helen, dear," she said, her weathered hands counting out exact change for her usual 3 jars. "I've been watching you. You've got something most people don't. You see opportunity where others see problems. I've got a little proposition for you." Eleanor's proposition was anything but little. She wanted me to help her manage her rental properties. Not as a property manager, mind you, but as a partner. She was getting too old to handle the day-to-day operations, and her nephew, who was supposed to inherit everything, had made it clear he was only interested in selling everything the moment she died. "I want someone who understands the value of building something lasting," she told me over coffee in her pristine Victorian parlor. "Someone who won't just cash out the moment things get difficult. I've been watching you for months, Helen. You're that someone." The arrangement was unusual, to say the least. Eleanor would teach me everything about real estate investment, property management, and business development. In exchange, I would handle the operations and gradually buy into the business. When she passed away, I would inherit her entire portfolio, provided I maintained it for at least 20 years and never sold more than 20% of the holdings. I threw myself into learning everything Eleanor could teach me. Evenings after Daniel went to bed, I studied property law, market analysis, and financial planning. Weekends, when Daniel was at baseball practice or sleeping over at friends' houses, I was touring properties, meeting with contractors, and learning to spot a good investment from a money pit. Eleanor was a tough teacher, but a fair one. She never let me take shortcuts, never allowed me to make excuses. When I made mistakes, and I made plenty, she would sit me down and make me walk through exactly what went wrong and how to avoid it in the future. "Money isn't just about having it, Helen," she used to say. "It's about understanding how it moves, how it grows, and most importantly, how to keep it. Anyone can get rich quick. Very few people know how to stay rich." By the time Daniel graduated high school, I owned 12 rental properties and had a net worth just shy of $2 million. Eleanor had passed away peacefully 3 years earlier, leaving me not just her business, but a detailed education in wealth management that most people pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to learn at elite universities. Daniel never knew the extent of our finances. As far as he was concerned, Mom worked hard managing some rental properties, and they lived comfortably but modestly. I drove a reliable Honda, shopped at discount stores, and clipped coupons. Our house was nice but not extravagant. I wanted him to understand the value of work, the importance of education, and the satisfaction of earning your way in the world. When Daniel met Ashley during his junior year at State University, I was genuinely happy for him. She was beautiful, ambitious, and studying business administration. She came from what she called a good family in Harbor Hills, which I later learned meant her father was a mid-level insurance executive and her mother taught elementary school. Comfortable but not wealthy. Ashley was charming in that calculated way some young women perfect in college. She always said the right thing, always asked about my day with just the right amount of interest, always complimented my cooking or my garden. But there was something in her eyes when she looked around our modest home, something that felt like she was taking inventory. The first red flag came during their engagement party. Ashley's parents, Robert and Linda Morrison, hosted it at the Harbor Hills Country Club. It was a lovely event, and I was grateful they'd included me in the planning. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't help but notice how Ashley introduced me to her friends and extended family. "Oh, this is Daniel's mother, Helen," she would say with that bright smile. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She manages rental properties around town. The way she said it made it sound like I was a cleaning lady or maintenance worker, not a successful business owner. And when people asked about my husband, she would quickly explain that I was widowed and had done such a good job raising Daniel on her own, considering the circumstances. Considering the circumstances, as if being widowed was a character flaw I'd somehow overcome through sheer determination. I bit my tongue and smiled through it all. Young people sometimes need time to develop grace and empathy. I figured marriage and maturity would help Ashley grow into the kind of woman who could appreciate the people in her life, rather than categorizing them by their perceived social status. Their wedding was beautiful. Ashley's parents paid for most of it, which I thought was generous given their own modest means. I contributed what I felt was appropriate: the flowers, the rehearsal dinner, and a check for $5,000 as a wedding gift. Daniel seemed happy, and that was all that mattered to me. The problems started about 6 months after they moved into their first apartment together. Daniel called me one evening, his voice tight with stress. "Mom, I hate to ask this, but could you possibly help us out with rent this month? Ashley's been having trouble finding work in her field, and my salary at the engineering firm isn't quite covering everything yet." Of course I helped. That's what mothers do. I wrote them a check for $800 and didn't think much of it. Young couples starting out always struggle financially. Thomas and I certainly had. But 1 month became 2, then 3, then 6. Each time, Daniel had a different explanation. Ashley's student loan payments were higher than expected. Their car needed expensive repairs. Ashley had found a job, but it wouldn't start for another month. The requests were always reasonable, always temporary, and always came with promises that they wouldn't need to ask again. By their first anniversary, I had given them nearly $12,000 in temporary assistance. And instead of gratitude, I began to notice a subtle shift in how Ashley treated me. She started making comments about my little rental business and how nice it must be to have such flexible work that allowed me to help out family whenever they needed it. She would mention casually how her friends' mothers-in-law took them shopping or treated them to spa days while I was always so busy with work. The truth was, my little rental business had grown into a significant real estate empire. I now owned 47 properties across 3 counties, including 2 small shopping centers and a residential development. My annual income was well into the 6 figures, and my net worth had climbed past $8 million. But I maintained the same modest lifestyle I'd always had, partly out of habit, and partly because I wanted to see what kind of people Daniel and Ashley truly were. When they thought I had limited resources, I was starting to get my answer, and I didn't like what I was seeing. The requests for money became more frequent and more substantial. Ashley decided she needed to go back to school for her MBA, which would cost $45,000 over 2 years. Daniel thought they should buy a house, but they needed help with the down payment. Ashley's car was embarrassingly old, and she needed something more professional for job interviews. Each request came with emotional manipulation wrapped in family obligations. "I just want to make you proud, Mom," Daniel would say. "Ashley really wants to contribute to the family, but she needs the right opportunities." Or Ashley would tear up and talk about how hard it was to build a life when you're starting from nothing, unlike some people who had family money to fall back on. The irony was suffocating. Here I was, a woman who had built considerable wealth, from absolutely nothing, being lectured about privilege by a young woman whose biggest hardship had been choosing between 2 middle-class colleges. But I kept writing the checks. Partly because I loved Daniel and wanted him to be happy, and partly because I was curious to see how far this would go. I told myself I was investing in my son's future, helping him build a stable foundation for his marriage. Looking back, I think I was really just buying time, hoping Ashley would eventually reveal some hidden depth or gratitude that would make all of this worthwhile. The money I gave them over those first 3 years of their marriage totaled just over $87,000. To them, it represented the difference between struggling and thriving. To me, it was less than what I made in 2 months from my property investments. But they didn't know that, and I was beginning to understand that the knowledge would only make things worse. Ashley had started to develop opinions about how I should be spending my money. She would mention, repeatedly, how much she admired people who really invested in their families' futures. She would talk about her friend Jennifer, whose mother-in-law had helped them buy a bigger house in a better neighborhood. Or her cousin Mark, whose parents had given him the money to start his own business. "It's so wonderful when families can really support each other's dreams," she would say, looking directly at me. "Some people are just naturally more generous, I suppose." The passive-aggressive hints became less passive over time. Ashley started asking direct questions about my finances, always framed as concern for my retirement planning or my long-term security. "Helen, I hope you're not overextending yourself helping us out," she would say with manufactured concern. "I know rental properties can be unpredictable, and you're not getting any younger. Have you thought about what you'll do if the market changes or if you have health problems?" The subtext was clear. She thought I was spending my nest egg on them and would eventually become their financial responsibility. In her mind, I was a struggling widow living month to month on rental income, foolishly giving away money I couldn't afford to lose. I should have corrected her assumptions. I should have explained that the money I was giving them represented a tiny fraction of my actual wealth, and that I was in no danger of financial hardship. But something held me back. Maybe it was pride, Or maybe it was the growing suspicion that Ashley's interest in my finances wasn't motivated by concern for my well-being. The photo studio incident happened during Daniel's 30th birthday celebration. Ashley had insisted on having professional family portraits taken to commemorate the milestone. She'd booked an expensive session with Marcus Chen, who was apparently the most sought-after portrait photographer in Harbor Hills. I was excited about the photos. It had been years since we'd had professional pictures taken, and I thought it would be lovely to have something beautiful to display in my home and give as gifts to extended family. Ashley had coordinated everything from scheduling to wardrobe consultation. She'd even suggested color schemes to ensure everyone looked coordinated and elegant. I followed her guidelines exactly, wearing the navy blue dress she'd selected and arriving at the studio precisely on time. The session started with shots of Daniel and Ashley together. Marcus was clearly talented, posing them in various arrangements around the studio's elegant settings. They looked like something from a magazine, all perfect smiles and carefully arranged hands. "Now let's get some with the whole family," I said, moving toward them when Marcus began adjusting his equipment for the next setup. That's when Ashley delivered the line that changed everything. "Actually, we'd prefer just the nuclear family in these shots. You understand, right, Helen? It's more intimate that way." The words hit me like a physical blow. Nuclear family. As if I was some distant relative or family friend. Not the woman who had raised Daniel from birth. Not the person who had supported their marriage both emotionally and financially for years. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Daniel was avoiding my eyes, fiddling with his shirt cuff like it was the most interesting thing in the world. Ashley was smiling that bright, fake smile she used when she was being particularly manipulative. "Of course, we'll do a few shots with you too," she added quickly, her tone suggesting she was being generous. "Maybe some nice mother and son photos. Those are always sweet." Mother and son photos. Like I was being thrown a consolation prize. Marcus, the photographer, looked uncomfortable. He clearly sensed the tension, but wasn't sure how to navigate it. "We could do a variety of combinations," he suggested diplomatically. "Family photos work best when everyone feels included." Ashley's smile never wavered, but her voice carried a subtle edge. "I think we know what works best for our family. Dynamic, Marcus. Let's stick with the plan we discussed." I wanted to say something. I wanted to demand an explanation for why the woman who had been asking me for money just last month was now treating me like an unwelcome stranger. But something in Daniel's posture stopped me. The way he stood just slightly behind Ashley, the way his shoulders curved inward like he was trying to make himself smaller, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't Ashley making a unilateral decision. This was Ashley making a decision that Daniel had agreed to, either actively or through his silence. My son, the boy I had raised alone, the young man I had supported through college and beyond, was choosing his wife's cruelty over his mother's dignity. "I understand," I said quietly. "I'll wait in the reception area." I spent the next 45 minutes sitting in a plush chair, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and camera clicks from the studio. Through the partially open door, I could hear Ashley directing Marcus on poses and angles, her voice animated and happy in a way it never was when she spoke to me. When the session was over, Daniel finally looked at me directly for the first time that day. "Mom, thank you for being so understanding about this. Ashley just has a very specific vision for how she wants these photos to look." Ashley nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. And don't worry, Helen. We made sure to book time for some lovely mother and son shots too. Marcus is going to do those next week when you can have Daniel's full attention." The way she said it made it clear that next week was never going to happen. This was her way of making the rejection seem temporary while ensuring it was actually permanent. I drove home that day in a state of profound clarity. For years, I had been telling myself that Ashley's behavior was just immaturity, that her selfishness was a phase she would outgrow. I had made excuses for her constant requests for money, her subtle criticisms of my lifestyle, her obvious embarrassment about my modest appearance and middle-class background. But the photo studio incident wasn't about money or social status. It was about family. And Ashley had made it crystal clear that she didn't consider me family. Worse, she had convinced Daniel to agree with her. That evening, I sat in my home office surrounded by financial documents I rarely looked at anymore. My accountant handled most of the day-to-day management of my investments, sending me quarterly reports that I filed away without much thought. But tonight, I wanted to see the full picture of what I had built over the past 25 years. The numbers were staggering, even to me. My real estate portfolio alone was worth just over $12 million. My investment accounts, retirement funds, and cash assets brought the total to nearly $18 million. I owned 63 rental properties, including a small strip mall, 2 apartment complexes, and a 40-unit luxury townhome development that generated monthly income well into the 6 figures. I had quietly become one of the wealthiest women in the county, and my son's wife thought I was a burden to be hidden from photographs. The plan formed slowly over the following weeks. I didn't wake up the next morning with a complete strategy for revenge. But as I watched Daniel and Ashley's behavior more carefully, noting their casual assumptions about my finances and their complete lack of gratitude for my support, I began to understand that I had been enabling something toxic. They had learned to see me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Every time I wrote them a check without question, every time I accepted Ashley's passive-aggressive comments without response, every time I allowed them to treat me like a convenient ATM, I was teaching them that my feelings and dignity were less important than their comfort. It was time for a different kind of education. The first step was subtle. When Daniel called to ask for help with Ashley's MBA tuition for the upcoming semester, I hesitated just long enough for the request to feel less automatic. "How much do you need?" I asked instead of immediately agreeing. "Well, tuition is $15,000 for this semester, plus books and fees. So maybe $16,000 total?" $16,000, said like it was a minor inconvenience, rather than more money than most people made in 6 months. "That's quite a bit," I said carefully. "How are you planning to handle the remaining semesters?" Daniel's voice carried a note of surprise, as if the question had never occurred to him. "I guess we figured we'd work it out as we go. You've been so generous, Mom. Ashley and I really appreciate everything you've done to invest in our future." Invest in our future. Not help out in an emergency. Not provide temporary assistance during a difficult time. Invest in our future, as if my money was simply another asset in their financial planning. "Let me think about it," I said. "I'll get back to you in a few days." The silence on the other end of the line was telling. Daniel had never heard me say anything other than yes to a request for money. "Oh, okay. Is everything all right, Mom? Are you having some kind of financial trouble?" The concern in his voice might have been touching if it wasn't so obviously self-interested. He wasn't worried about my well-being. He was worried about his access to my checkbook. "Everything's fine," I assured him. "I just want to make sure I'm making good decisions with my money." When I called him back 3 days later, I had an answer he wasn't expecting. "I've thought about the tuition, and I think it's time for you and Ashley to explore other funding options. Have you looked into student loans or work-study programs?" Another long silence. "Mom, we really can't afford to take on more debt, right now. Ashley's degree is going to benefit our whole family. It's an investment in all of our futures." There was that word again. Investment. As if my money was somehow collectively owned. "I understand that," I said gently. "But I also think it's important for young couples to learn to manage their finances independently. I've been very generous over the years, and I want to make sure that generosity isn't preventing you from developing your own financial skills." The conversation ended with Daniel promising to look into other options and getting back to me. What he actually did was send Ashley to my house 2 days later with a folder full of paperwork and a carefully rehearsed speech about investment opportunities and family loyalty. Ashley sat at my kitchen table, spreading out brochures and financial documents like a presentation she'd prepared for a business meeting. "Helen, I've been doing a lot of research about MBA programs and their return on investment," she began, her voice warm and professional. "The average salary increase for someone with my background and work experience is about 40% within 2 years of graduation. That means the $60,000 we're investing in my education will pay for itself in less than 5 years. We're investing. Not you're investing or I'm borrowing. We're investing, as if she and I were business partners entering into a mutual venture. And honestly," she continued, "I think this is exactly the kind of opportunity Eleanor Hartwell would have encouraged you to pursue." I nearly choked on my coffee. "I'm sorry, what?" Ashley smiled triumphantly, clearly pleased with herself. "I've been researching Eleanor Hartwell, the woman who left you the rental properties. She was obviously a very savvy businesswoman who understood the importance of investing in people's potential. I think she would have loved seeing you use her legacy to help family members achieve their dreams." The audacity was breathtaking. Not only had Ashley completely misunderstood my relationship with Eleanor and the nature of my business success, but she was now presuming to speak for a dead woman she'd never met in order to manipulate me into funding her education. But what really stunned me was the casual way she'd said, "the woman who left you the rental properties," as if my entire business empire was some kind of inheritance windfall, rather than something I'd built through decades of hard work and smart decisions. "Ashley," I said carefully, "where did you get the idea that Eleanor left me the rental properties?" She looked confused by the question. "Well, Daniel said you inherited your business from some old lady you used to help. I just assumed that's how you got started in real estate. Daniel had been telling people I inherited my wealth. Not that I'd earned it, not that I'd built it from nothing, but that I'd inherited it from some old lady I used to help. As if I was some kind of opportunistic caregiver who'd wormed my way into a wealthy woman's will." "I see," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "And what else has Daniel told you about my business?" Ashley launched into a detailed explanation of what she believed to be my financial situation. According to Daniel's version of events, I had inherited 12 rental properties from Eleanor about 15 years ago. I'd been lucky with property values in the area, so the properties had appreciated nicely. But rental income was unpredictable, and I was probably making somewhere around $60,000 a year on average. I was, in their estimation, comfortable, but not wealthy. Secure enough to help out family occasionally, but not so rich that I could afford to be truly generous without sacrificing my own financial stability. Daniel and I have actually been worried about you," Ashley continued, her voice taking on that fake concern I'd learned to recognize. "We know you've been so generous with us, but we also know that property management can be stressful for someone your age. Have you thought about selling some of the properties and investing in something more stable?" Something more stable. She was essentially suggesting I liquidate my assets and put the money into conservative investments that would generate lower returns but require less active management. It was the kind of advice you'd give to an elderly person who was no longer capable of handling complex financial decisions. I thanked Ashley for her concern and told her I would consider her proposal about the MBA funding. After she left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about the conversation and everything it revealed. Daniel and Ashley didn't see me as a successful businesswoman who had built substantial wealth through intelligence and hard work. They saw me as a lucky widow who had stumbled into some rental properties and was probably too old and simple to manage them properly. In their minds, I was essentially an elderly child who needed their guidance and protection. More importantly, they had convinced themselves that my money was somehow partially theirs. Not in a legal sense, but in a moral sense. They felt entitled to my support because they were family, and they interpreted any reluctance on my part as selfishness or financial anxiety rather than a reasonable boundary. The photo studio incident suddenly made perfect sense. You don't include the hired help in family portraits, even if the hired help has been foolishly generous with their modest savings. That night, I called my attorney and my financial advisor. It was time to make some changes to my estate planning, and it was time to have some difficult conversations about family dynamics and financial boundaries. But first, I wanted to do a little research of my own. If Daniel and Ashley thought they understood my financial situation, I wanted to understand theirs. What I discovered over the next few weeks was illuminating. Ashley hadn't been having trouble finding work in her field for the past 3 years. She'd been working part-time as a retail manager while waiting for the perfect opportunity to present itself. She wasn't unemployed, she was underemployed by choice, turning down positions that didn't meet her standards for prestige or salary. Daniel's salary at the engineering firm was actually quite good for someone his age and experience level. They weren't struggling to pay their bills. They were struggling to maintain the lifestyle they felt they deserved on the income they were actually earning. The apartment they'd been complaining about for months wasn't a cramped studio in a bad neighborhood. It was a spacious 2-bedroom unit in one of Harbor Hill's most desirable complexes, complete with a fitness center, pool, and concierge service. Their rent was more than most people's mortgage payments. Ashley's embarrassingly old car was a 3-year-old sedan with low mileage and every available upgrade. Daniel drove a truck he'd bought new the year before. Neither of them had any significant debt beyond normal monthly expenses and Ashley's student loans. They weren't poor, they weren't even struggling. They were a comfortable middle-class couple who had gotten accustomed to living above their means because they'd found someone willing to subsidize the difference. And that someone was me, the woman they'd just excluded from their family photographs. The clarity was liberating. For the first time in years, I could see the situation exactly as it was, without the complicating emotions of love and hope and maternal guilt. Daniel and Ashley were users, polite, charming, family-oriented users. But users nonetheless. They had identified me as a resource and had spent 3 years systematically exploiting that resource while carefully managing my perception of their gratitude and need. Every request for money came with just enough vulnerability and appreciation to keep me engaged, but never enough respect or genuine affection to satisfy me. I had been funding my own emotional neglect, paying premium prices for the privilege of being treated like a convenient bank rather than a beloved family member. It was time to close that bank. The next phase of my plan required patience and careful observation. I needed to understand exactly how Daniel and Ashley viewed our financial relationship, and I needed to document their behavior in a way that would make my eventual response impossible to misinterpret. I started saying no to their requests, but strategically, not every time, and not without explanation. I wanted to see how they responded to boundaries without pushing them to the point where they stopped asking altogether. When Daniel called to ask for help with a security deposit on a new apartment, I told him I was having some unexpected expenses with property maintenance and wouldn't be able to help for a few months. When Ashley mentioned needing a loan for professional wardrobe updates, I suggested she might want to start building her own credit history instead of relying on family assistance. The responses were telling. Daniel became increasingly anxious about my financial stability, calling more frequently to check on my situation and offering unsolicited advice about simplifying my business operations. Ashley became more aggressive in her suggestions that I consider selling properties and investing in safer options that wouldn't require so much hands-on management. Neither of them seemed concerned about my well-being as much as they were worried about my ability to continue supporting them. Their questions weren't about my health or happiness. They were about my cash flow and asset liquidity. The breaking point came when Ashley decided to stage an intervention. She showed up at my house on a Saturday morning with Daniel in tow, both of them carrying serious expressions and manila folders full of what Ashley called helpful information. "Helen, we need to talk," Ashley announced, settling into my living room like she was preparing for a business meeting. Daniel and I have been really concerned about you lately, and we think it's time for an honest conversation about your financial future. Daniel looked uncomfortable, but didn't object as Ashley spread paperwork across my coffee table. Brochures. For financial planning services, information about property management companies, and printouts of articles about retirement planning for widows. We know you've been stressed about money lately, Ashley continued, and we want you to know that we're here to help you make some smart decisions before things get worse. Before things get worse. As if my refusal to fund their lifestyle choices was evidence of financial crisis rather than simple boundaries. We've actually been researching some options that might be perfect for your situation, Ashley said, pulling out a highlighted brochure. There are companies that specialize in helping people your age transition out of property management. They'll handle the sale of your rental units and help you invest the proceeds in stable, low-maintenance funds that will provide steady income without all the stress. Daniel finally spoke up, his voice gentle but patronizing. Mom, we just don't want you to feel like you have to handle all of this alone. Managing properties is a lot of work, and we can see how it's wearing on you. Wearing on me. I wanted to laugh. The only thing wearing on me was their constant demands for money and their complete inability to appreciate what I'd accomplished. And honestly, Ashley added, leaning forward conspiratorially, we think Eleanor probably didn't realize how complicated she was making your life when she left you all those properties. She meant well, but she probably should have just left you a simple cash inheritance instead of expecting you to manage a whole business. There it was again, the assumption that my success was accidental, that my wealth was inherited rather than earned, that I was too simple or too old to handle my own financial affairs. I listened to their entire presentation with growing amazement. They had convinced themselves that they were doing me a favor by pressuring me to liquidate my assets and move into what amounted to financial retirement. Never mind that I was only 62 and in excellent health. Never mind that my business was thriving and generating more income every year. In their minds, I was a confused elderly woman who needed their guidance to avoid making costly mistakes with money I didn't really understand. When they finished their presentation, I thanked them for their concern and promised to consider their suggestions. Then I asked a question that clearly caught them off guard. I'm curious about something, I said. If I did decide to sell some properties and invest more conservatively, what do you think that would mean for your own financial planning? Daniel and Ashley exchanged a look that lasted just a moment too long. What do you mean? Ashley asked. Well, you've been counting on my help with various expenses over the years. If I'm living on a fixed income from conservative investments instead of active rental income, I probably wouldn't be able to continue providing that kind of support. How would that affect your plans for Ashley's education or buying a house, or any of the other goals you've mentioned? Another pause. Another exchanged look. Mom, we're not asking you to change your finances so you can give us money, Daniel said, but his voice lacked conviction. We're concerned about your security and your stress levels. Of course, I agreed. But I'm just wondering if you've thought about the practical implications. Have you been budgeting as if my financial help was temporary, or have you been counting on it as part of your long-term financial plan? Ashley's carefully maintained composure cracked just slightly. I think you're misunderstanding our motivations, Helen. This isn't about money. This is about family taking care of family. Family taking care of family. Interesting how that phrase only seemed to apply in one direction. I assured them I would carefully consider everything they'd presented, and they left with satisfied expressions, clearly believing they'd successfully manipulated me into making financial decisions that would benefit them. What they didn't know was that they'd just provided me with all the evidence I needed to proceed with the final phase of my plan. That afternoon, I called my attorney and scheduled a meeting for the following week. It was time to make some changes to my will, and it was time to establish some new rules for family financial support. But first, I had a different kind of appointment to make. I called Marcus Chen, the photographer from the family portrait session, and booked a private session for the following Saturday. If Ashley wanted to define family by who appeared in photographs, I was happy to play by her rules. I was about to show her what being locked out really felt like. The private photography session with Marcus Chen was scheduled for the following Saturday at 10 in the morning. I arrived early, dressed in an elegant emerald green silk blouse and tailored black slacks that I'd purchased specifically for the occasion. Not from my usual discount stores, but from Nordstrom, where the sales associate had treated me with the kind of respectful attention that comes with expensive taste and a platinum credit card. Marcus greeted me warmly, clearly pleased to have a client who appreciated professional photography for its own sake, rather than as a social media prop. His studio was beautiful in the morning light, all clean lines and carefully positioned equipment that spoke to years of expertise. "Mrs. Rosewood, I have to say, I'm excited about this session," he said as he adjusted his camera settings. "After working with so many families who seem stressed about getting the perfect shot, it's refreshing to work with someone who just wants beautiful portraits." We spent 2 hours creating images that captured something I hadn't seen in myself for years: confidence, elegance, and quiet strength. Marcus had an artist's eye for lighting and composition, and he seemed to understand intuitively that these photos were about more than just documentation. They were about reclaiming something that had been taken from me. When we reviewed the digital proofs on his computer screen, I was genuinely surprised by what I saw. The woman in those photographs looked nothing like the modest, accommodating mother-in-law Ashley had excluded from her family pictures. She looked like someone with substance, someone with secrets, someone who commanded respect. "These are stunning," I told Marcus honestly. "You've captured something I didn't even know was there." He smiled and nodded toward one particular image, where I was seated in a leather chair, my hands folded calmly in my lap, my expression serene but unmistakably authoritative. "That one's my favorite. You look like a woman who knows exactly who she is and what she's worth." I ordered prints of all the best shots, including several large format versions suitable for framing. Then I asked Marcus for a favor that made him raise his eyebrows with interest. "I'd like you to create a digital album that can be shared via email," I said. "Something elegant and professional that showcases the best images from today's session." "Of course," he said. "Are you planning to share these with family?" "Something like that," I replied with a smile that Marcus would probably remember for weeks. The digital album arrived in my inbox on Tuesday morning, along with a note from Marcus expressing his pleasure at working with such a gracious client. The album was indeed elegant, presenting the photographs in a sophisticated layout that emphasized their artistic quality. I forwarded the album to 3 people: my attorney, my financial advisor, and my insurance agent. Each of them had been working with me for years, but I realized they'd never seen current photographs of me. For business purposes, it seemed appropriate to update their files with professional images. Within hours, all 3 had responded with variations of the same message: surprise and admiration for the transformation they saw in the photographs. My attorney, David Walsh, put it most directly: "Helen, these photos show a completely different side of your personality. You look like the successful businesswoman you are, not the modest widow you've been pretending to be." Pretending to be. That phrase stuck with me for days as I considered the deeper implications of what David had observed. Had I been pretending to be modest and unassuming, or had Ashley and Daniel's constant subtle dismissals actually convinced me to diminish myself? The answer came to me gradually over the following weeks as I began making small changes to how I presented myself in public. Instead of shopping at discount stores, I started patronizing the same boutiques where Ashley bought her clothes. Instead of driving my reliable Honda, I leased a BMW sedan that reflected my actual financial status. Instead of downplaying my business success in casual conversations, I began describing my work with the accuracy it deserved. The reactions were immediate and illuminating. People who had known me for years suddenly started treating me differently. Store clerks became more attentive, service providers became more accommodating, and social acquaintances became more interested in cultivating friendships. Most telling of all was the response from other business owners in the community. I had always kept a low profile in local business circles, preferring to operate quietly and avoid attention. But when I started attending Chamber of Commerce meetings and real estate investor gatherings, I discovered that my reputation in professional circles was quite different from my reputation in social circles. At a quarterly meeting of the Regional Property Owners Association, I was introduced to several investors who immediately recognized my name and expressed admiration for my portfolio management strategies. One woman, Sandra Martinez, who owned a successful property development company, pulled me aside after the meeting. "Helen, I've been following your acquisitions for years through public records," she said. "Your instincts for undervalued properties are legendary among serious investors. I had no idea you kept such a low profile personally." "I prefer to let the work speak for itself," I replied, which was true but incomplete. Sandra nodded approvingly. "That's smart in this business, but I hope you're getting the recognition you deserve from your family. Building what you've built, especially starting from nothing after losing your husband, that's extraordinary." The conversation with Sandra crystallized something I'd been avoiding for months. I had spent so many years protecting Daniel from the pressure and complexity of wealth that I'd never given him the opportunity to appreciate what I'd actually accomplished. In trying to raise him with normal middle-class values, I had inadvertently taught him to see my success as accidental rather than earned. And Ashley, coming from her own middle-class background, had no framework for understanding the difference between inherited wealth and self-made wealth. To her, money was money, regardless of how it was acquired or what effort it represented. The irony was bitter. In my effort to remain humble and approachable, I had made myself invisible. And invisible people, I was learning, become easy to dismiss. The next test of my new approach came when Daniel called to discuss Ashley's MBA program again. The semester was starting in 6 weeks, and they still hadn't secured funding for her tuition. "Mom, I hate to bring this up again, but we're running out of time to get Ashley registered for fall classes," he said, his voice carrying that familiar mixture of anxiety and expectation. "We've looked into student loans, but the interest rates are pretty high. We were hoping you might reconsider helping out with the tuition." Instead of my usual immediate response, I paused long enough to let the silence become noticeable. "Daniel, I've been thinking about our conversation, and I have some questions about Ashley's career plans." "Questions?" "Well, she's been working part-time for 3 years while waiting for the right opportunity. What specific goals does she have for after graduation? Has she identified particular companies or positions she's targeting?" Daniel was clearly unprepared for this line of inquiry. "I mean, she wants to move into corporate management. The MBA will open up a lot of opportunities." "I'm sure it will," I agreed. "But $60,000 is a significant investment. As a businesswoman, I always want to understand the expected return before committing resources. Has Ashley done any research on salary ranges for MBA graduates in this area? Has she networked with potential employers or identified mentors in her target field?" Another pause. "Mom, I think you might be overthinking this. Ashley is smart and ambitious. The degree will definitely help her career." "I'm sure she is." "Smart and ambitious," I said. "But smart, ambitious people usually have detailed plans for leveraging their investments. Has she considered part-time programs that would allow her to work full-time and gain experience while studying? Has she looked into companies that offer tuition assistance for employees?" I could hear Daniel's frustration building. "Look, Mom, if you don't want to help, just say so. You don't need to interrogate us about our life choices." The defensiveness in his voice told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't done any real planning or research. They had simply assumed that Wanting something was sufficient justification for asking me to pay for it. "Daniel, I want to help you succeed," I said calmly. "But I also want to make sure that my help is actually helpful. Sometimes the best thing a parent can do is encourage independence and self-reliance." "Self-reliance?" Daniel's voice rose slightly. "Mom, you know we're grateful for everything you've done, but Ashley and I are trying to build a future together. We're not asking for charity. We're asking for investment in our family's success." There was that word again. Investment. As if my money came with an automatic expectation of shared returns. "I understand that," I said. "But before I make any investment decisions, I like to meet with all the stakeholders and review the business plan. Why don't you and Ashley come over for dinner this weekend? We can discuss her MBA goals in detail, and I can get a better sense of how this fits into your overall financial strategy." Daniel agreed, but his tone suggested he thought I was being unnecessarily complicated about what should have been a simple family transaction. The dinner was scheduled for Saturday evening, and I spent considerable time preparing both the meal and my approach. I wanted to create an atmosphere that was welcoming, but also unmistakably serious. This wasn't going to be a casual family gathering where money requests could be slipped in between dessert and coffee. Ashley and Daniel arrived promptly at 6, both dressed more formally than usual. Ashley was wearing a navy blue dress and pearls that I recognized as expensive, and Daniel had opted for khakis and a button-down shirt rather than his usual jeans and polo. We started with cocktails in the living room, where Ashley immediately noticed the new photographs from my session with Marcus Chen. I had replaced several older family photos with the professional portraits, creating a subtle but noticeable shift in the room's atmosphere. "Helen, these pictures are beautiful," Ashley said, studying the largest print with obvious surprise. "When did you have these taken?" "A few weeks ago," I replied. "I decided it was time to update my professional photography." "Professional photography?" Daniel asked. "What do you need professional photos for?" It was a revealing question. In Daniel's mind, professional photography was something people used for LinkedIn profiles or corporate websites. The idea that I might need such photos had never occurred to him because he'd never thought of me as someone with a professional identity worth documenting. "I've been more active in business networking lately," I explained. "Professional photos are useful for marketing materials, speaking engagements, that sort of thing." Ashley and Daniel exchanged a quick look that I pretended not to notice. The idea of me having marketing materials or speaking engagements was clearly news to them. We moved to the dining room, where I had set the table with my good china and crystal. Not the everyday dishes we usually used for family dinners, but the elegant set that Thomas and I had received as a wedding gift and that I rarely had occasion to use. Over dinner, I guided the conversation systematically through Ashley's MBA plans, asking detailed questions about her academic focus, career objectives, and post-graduation timeline. What emerged was a picture of someone who had given far more thought to the prestige of having an MBA than to the practical applications of the degree. Ashley's answers were vague and aspirational. She wanted to move into leadership roles and make a real impact in the business world. When I asked about specific industries or companies she was targeting, she mentioned several Fortune 500 corporations without any apparent understanding of their business models or hiring practices. When I inquired about her networking strategies or internship plans, she seemed surprised by the questions. When I asked about her post-graduation salary expectations, she cited figures that were unrealistic for someone with her limited experience, even with an MBA. It became clear that Ashley viewed the MBA as a magic credential that would automatically transform her employment prospects, rather than as specialized training that needed to be strategically applied. She had done virtually no research into the job market, made no contacts in her target industries, and developed no concrete plans for leveraging the degree. Most tellingly, when I asked about her backup plans if the MBA didn't lead to immediate career advancement. She looked genuinely confused by the question. "I don't think I need backup plans," she said with a laugh. "The degree speaks for itself." Daniel nodded supportively, clearly sharing her confidence. Neither of them seemed to understand that an MBA from a decent but not elite program was only as valuable as the strategic thinking and professional network that accompanied it. After dinner, I served coffee in the living room and shifted the conversation to broader financial planning. "I've been thinking about my own financial future lately," I said, settling into my favorite chair with my coffee cup. "At my age, it's important to make sure I'm being smart about asset management and long-term security." Ashley immediately perked up, clearly sensing an opportunity to revive her earlier suggestions about simplifying my business operations. "That's so wise, Helen," she said earnestly. "Daniel and I have actually been talking about that too. We really think you should consider working with a financial planner to optimize your portfolio." "Actually, I've been working with a financial advisor for 15 years, I said casually. "Richard Harrison at Wellington Wealth Management. He's helped me build quite a substantial portfolio over the years." Daniel looked surprised. "I didn't know you worked with a financial advisor." "There's a lot you don't know about my business operations," I replied with a smile. "Richard has been invaluable in helping me diversify beyond real estate. My investment portfolio has grown considerably over the past decade." Ashley leaned forward with obvious interest. "That's fantastic. It's so important to have professional guidance with these things. What kind of returns have you been seeing?" The question was remarkably direct, even for Ashley. She was essentially asking me to disclose specific details about my investment performance. "Oh, I don't discuss specific numbers," I said easily. "But Richard tells me I'm performing well above average for someone in my demographic." "That's wonderful," Ashley said, though her expression suggested she was frustrated by my vagueness. "Have you thought about what kind of legacy planning you want to do? I mean, with Daniel being your only child, there are probably some tax advantages to strategic gifting." Strategic gifting. Ashley was now openly discussing how I should be giving away my money to minimize tax implications. The pretense of concern for my welfare was becoming increasingly thin. "Actually, Ashley, that raises an interesting point," I said. "Legacy planning is complicated when family dynamics are evolving. For instance, if Daniel and I have different perspectives on financial responsibility, that might affect how I structure my estate." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean, different perspectives on financial responsibility?" "Well, for example, I've noticed that you tend to view my financial support as an investment in our future rather than as my personal choice to help you temporarily. That suggests we might have different ideas about money and family obligations." The room went very quiet. Ashley's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips, and Daniel's face showed the careful blankness that meant he was trying to process something unexpected. "Mom, I don't understand what you're getting at," Daniel said slowly. "I'm not criticizing you," I said gently. "I'm just observing that perspective shapes behavior. If you see my money as partially yours by virtue of family relationship, you might make different decisions than if you see it as entirely mine to do with as I choose." Ashley set down her coffee cup with a sharp click. "Helen, I hope you're not suggesting that we've been presumptuous about your generosity. We've always been grateful for your help." "Of course you have," I agreed. "But gratitude and entitlement can sometimes coexist in ways that people don't recognize. It's human nature." "Entitlement?" Daniel's voice carried a note of offense. "Mom, we've never demanded anything from you. We've asked for help and you've chosen to give it." "That's absolutely true," I said. "But asking and choosing can happen within different frameworks. For instance, when you ask for help with Ashley's tuition, are you asking me to consider a request that I might reasonably decline? Or are you asking me to fulfill an obligation that you expect me to honor?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Daniel and Ashley looked at each other, and I could see them both struggling to formulate responses that wouldn't reveal too much about their actual expectations. "We would never want you to feel obligated," Ashley said carefully, "but we also think that families should support each other when possible." "I agree completely," I said, "but support can take many forms. Sometimes the most supportive thing a parent can do is encourage independence. Sometimes it's providing resources. Sometimes it's setting boundaries that promote growth." Daniel was getting visibly frustrated. "Mom, what are you actually trying to say here? If you don't want to help with Ashley's tuition, just tell us directly." "I'm trying to understand what kind of help would actually be most beneficial," I said. "For instance, if I pay for Ashley's MBA, what happens when she graduates and discovers that the job market is more competitive than she expected? What happens if the degree doesn't immediately lead to the salary increases she's anticipating?" Ashley's face flushed slightly. "I think you're being unnecessarily pessimistic about my prospects." "I'm not being pessimistic," I said. "I'm being realistic. Business education is valuable, but it's not magic. Success requires strategy, networking, persistence, and often some luck. If I remove the financial pressure that might motivate you to develop those skills, I might actually be hindering your professional development." "So you're saying no to the tuition," Daniel said flatly. "I'm saying I want to make sure that whatever I do is genuinely helpful rather than just convenient for everyone in the short term." Ashley stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking. "Helen, I think you're overcomplicating this. Daniel and I are responsible adults who are perfectly capable of managing our own careers and finances. We're not asking you to make decisions for us. We're asking you to invest in our success." "And I appreciate that," I said, remaining seated and keeping my voice calm. "But as someone who's spent 25 years making investment decisions, I've learned that the best investments are based on thorough analysis rather than emotional appeals." "Emotional appeals?" Ashley's voice rose. "Is that what you think this is?" Daniel put a hand on Ashley's arm, trying to diffuse the situation, but she shook him off. "You know what, Helen? I think the real issue here is that you're uncomfortable with the idea of Daniel and me becoming financially independent. You've gotten used to being needed, and you're worried that if we don't require your help anymore, we won't have time for you." The accusation was so completely backwards that I almost laughed. Ashley had just suggested that I was withholding financial support because I was afraid of losing my emotional connection to them, when the reality was that I was reevaluating my financial support because I was tired of being valued primarily for my money. "That's an interesting perspective," I said evenly. "What makes you think I'm uncomfortable with your independence?" Ashley gestured around the room, taking in the formal dinner setting and professional photographs. "All of this, the fancy dinner, the serious questions, the business-like conversation. You're treating us like strangers instead of family." "I'm treating you like adults," I corrected. "There's a difference." Daniel finally spoke up, his voice tight with frustration. "Mom, Ashley's right. This whole evening has felt like a job interview rather than a family discussion. We came here expecting to talk about practical matters, and instead we're getting interrogated about our life plans. I asked you questions about Ashley's career goals because you're asking me to invest $60,000 in her education," I said. "If that feels like an interrogation, perhaps the issue isn't my questions, but your preparation for answering them." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Ashley was staring at me with open hostility, and Daniel looked like he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't understand. Finally, Ashley spoke, her voice cold and controlled. "Helen, I think we need to be honest about what's really happening here. You've been acting differently ever since the photo session, and now you're using money as a way to control our relationship. That's not healthy for anyone." "The photo session," I repeated thoughtfully. "You mean when you decided that your family portraits would be more intimate without me in them? Ashley's face flushed deeper. That was about composition and aesthetic preferences. You're taking it personally when it wasn't personal at all. I see, I said. So, excluding me from family photographs wasn't personal, but asking detailed questions about a major financial request is personal? Those are completely different situations, Ashley snapped. You're right, I agreed. They are completely different. One was about your preferences for how your family should be publicly represented. The other is about my preferences for how my money should be invested. I'm surprised you see the second as more problematic than the first. Daniel stood up, clearly wanting to end the conversation before it deteriorated further. Mom, I think we should probably call it a night. Everyone's getting upset, and that's not productive. I'm not upset, I said honestly. I'm clarified. This conversation has been very helpful for understanding how we all view money and family obligations. Ashley gathered her purse with sharp, angry movements. I hope you're satisfied with whatever point you think you've made tonight, Helen. But this kind of manipulation isn't going to bring you closer to your family. What kind of manipulation? I asked with genuine curiosity. Using money to control people's behavior, making them jump through hoops to prove they're worthy of your support. It's a classic power play. I considered this accusation as they prepared to leave. Ashley, in your opinion, what would non-manipulative financial support look like? She paused, clearly not having expected me to engage with her criticism directly. It would look like trusting your family and supporting their goals without conditions. Unconditional financial support, I mused. No questions asked, no expectations, no requirements for accountability or planning. Within reason, yes. And if that unconditional support enabled poor decision-making or reduced motivation to develop independence, that's condescending, Ashley shot back. You're assuming we can't be trusted to make good decisions. I'm not assuming anything, I said. I'm asking questions that any responsible investor would ask before committing significant resources. If those questions feel condescending, perhaps the issue is that you haven't thought through the answers. They left without resolving anything, but that was fine with me. The evening had accomplished exactly what I'd hoped. It had forced all of us to articulate our expectations and assumptions about money and family obligations. What had become crystal clear was that Daniel and Ashley viewed my money as a family resource that should be available to them with minimal oversight or conditions. They saw my questions about Ashley's career planning as unreasonable interference, rather than due diligence. More importantly, they had revealed that they interpreted any boundaries or expectations as manipulation and control. In their minds, truly loving family support meant writing checks without asking questions. It was a perspective that might be reasonable if I were a wealthy parent distributing allowances to young children. But Ashley was 28 years old and Daniel was 30. They were established adults asking for substantial financial assistance, and they were offended by the suggestion that such assistance should come with any accountability. The next morning, I called my attorney and scheduled an appointment for the following week. It was time to make some concrete changes to my estate planning, and it was time to establish formal policies for future family financial support. But first, I had one more experiment to conduct. I wanted to see how Daniel and Ashley would respond to a different kind of boundary, one that had nothing to do with money. The opportunity came 2 weeks later when Ashley called to invite me to a barbecue at their apartment complex. It was a casual community event, and she mentioned that several of her friends and their families would be attending. It'll be fun, Helen, she said, her voice carefully cheerful despite the lingering tension from our dinner conversation. Just a relaxed afternoon by the pool. You should come meet some of our neighbors. I accepted the invitation, but with a condition that caught Ashley off guard. That sounds lovely, I said. I'll plan to attend, and I'd like to bring a guest, if that's all right. A guest? Ashley's voice carried a note of surprise. Of course, that's fine. Who were you thinking of bringing? Marcus Chen, I said casually. The photographer who took my professional portraits. He's become a friend, and I thought he might enjoy meeting some younger people in the area. The pause that followed was long enough to be significant. Oh, Ashley said finally. I didn't realize you were socializing with the photographer. Marcus is an interesting person, I said. Very talented, very cultured. We've discovered we have a lot in common. This was true, though not in the way Ashley was probably interpreting it. Marcus and I had struck up a friendship based on shared interests in art and photography, and he had mentioned wanting to meet more people in the community. But I was curious to see how Ashley would respond to the idea of me having an independent social life that didn't revolve around family obligations. Well, sure, Ashley said, though her tone suggested she was anything but sure. The more the merrier. Wonderful. I'll see you Saturday afternoon. Marcus was delighted by the invitation and agreed immediately. He was new to the area and genuinely interested in meeting potential clients and friends. He was also, I had to admit, an attractive and charming man in his early 50s, who carried himself with the quiet confidence that comes with artistic success. Saturday arrived with perfect weather for an outdoor gathering. I dressed carefully, in a flowing sundress and sandals that struck the right balance between casual and elegant. Marcus arrived to pick me up in his silver Lexus, looking handsome in khakis and a linen shirt. I have to say, Helen, I'm curious about your family, he said as we drove to Ashley and Daniel's complex. You've mentioned them, but always in ways that suggest some complexity. All families are complex, I replied diplomatically. But yes, there are some interesting dynamics at play. The barbecue was already in full swing when we arrived at the pool area. Ashley and Daniel were stationed near the grills, along with several other young couples and their children. The atmosphere was casual and friendly, with music playing and people laughing. Ashley spotted me immediately and hurried over, her eyes taking in Marcus with obvious assessment. Helen, you made it, she said with forced enthusiasm. And this must be Marcus. I made the introductions, watching Ashley's expression as Marcus charmed her with his easy manner and genuine interest in her work and the community. Within minutes, she was laughing at his stories about difficult clients and artistic challenges. Daniel joined us, and I could see him evaluating Marcus with the particular wariness that men sometimes show toward other men in ambiguous social situations. Marcus handled this expertly, asking Daniel about his engineering work and showing genuine interest in the technical aspects of his projects. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself enjoying Marcus's company and the relaxed social environment in ways I hadn't experienced in years. Marcus was an excellent conversationalist who seemed equally comfortable discussing art, travel, business, or current events. Several other guests gravitated toward our conversations, and I realized I was having more fun at this casual barbecue than I'd had at family gatherings in recent memory. What was most interesting was watching Ashley's reaction to this development. She kept circling back to our group, clearly monitoring how I was interacting with Marcus and how other people were responding to both of us. When Marcus complimented the complex's landscaping and mentioned that he was looking for a new apartment in the area, Ashley immediately jumped into helpful mode, offering to give him a tour of the amenities and put him in touch with the leasing office. Helen didn't mention you were apartment hunting, she said as she led us toward the fitness center. It's a recent decision, Marcus replied. I've been living downtown, but I'm ready for something with more space and a better community feel. Downtown can be so impersonal, Ashley agreed. This complex has such a nice family atmosphere. Very welcoming, very social. I listened to this exchange with growing amusement. Ashley was essentially trying to recruit Marcus to move into her neighborhood, despite having met him less than 2 hours earlier. The motivation was transparent. She wanted to keep tabs on whatever relationship might be developing between us. As we toured the facilities, Marcus made appreciative comments about the pool, the tennis courts, and the community room. When Ashley mentioned rental prices and availability, he seemed genuinely interested. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "this might be exactly what I'm looking for. Helen, what do you think? Would you recommend the area?" All eyes turned to me, and I realized this was another test moment. Ashley was clearly hoping I would encourage Marcus to move nearby, which would satisfy her curiosity and give her a sense of control over our friendship. Daniel was watching with the careful neutrality of someone trying not to reveal his own opinions. "I think you should choose based on what works best for your lifestyle and career," I said diplomatically. "The community seems very nice, but there are many nice communities in the area." It was a perfectly reasonable response, but I could see Ashley's slight frown at my refusal to enthusiastically endorse her neighborhood as the obvious choice for Marcus. The afternoon continued pleasantly, with Marcus fitting seamlessly into the social dynamic and charming everyone he met. As we prepared to leave, Ashley walked us to the parking area. "Marcus, it was so wonderful meeting you," she said warmly. "I hope you'll consider the complex seriously. And even if you don't move here, you should definitely come back for more events. We do these gatherings regularly." "That's very kind," Marcus replied. "I've had a lovely time. Helen, thank you for including me." As we drove away, Marcus was quiet for a few minutes before speaking. "Your daughter-in-law is quite something," he said finally. "In what way?" "She's very invested in managing social situations. I got the distinct impression she was trying to orchestrate something specific with my potential move to the area." I smiled at his perceptiveness. "Ashley does like to be involved in people's decisions. And your son seemed somewhat protective, though he tried to hide it. Daniel has always been cautious about change." Marcus glanced at me with a knowing expression. "Helen, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but the family dynamics I observed today were quite different from what I would have expected based on your descriptions." "How so?" "You talked about them as if they were the center of your world, the people you'd sacrificed everything for. But watching you today, you seemed much more independent and self-possessed than someone whose identity revolves around family caretaking." It was an astute observation that made me consider how I'd been describing my relationships even to myself. "Perhaps," I said slowly, "I've been defining myself by old patterns that don't fit my current reality." "That's very common," Marcus said gently. "We often continue telling ourselves stories about who we are long after we've actually changed." The conversation with Marcus crystallized something I'd been sensing, but hadn't fully articulated. I had spent so many years defining myself as Daniel's mother and Ashley's supportive mother-in-law that I'd lost track of Helen Rosewood, the successful businesswoman, the independent individual, the person who existed separate from family relationships. The woman in those professional photographs wasn't someone I'd become. She was someone I'd always been, but had forgotten how to see. That evening, I sat in my home office reviewing financial documents and thinking about legacy planning in ways I'd never considered before. For years, I had assumed that everything I built would eventually belong to Daniel and his family. It was such a fundamental assumption that I'd never questioned it, never considered alternatives. But assumptions, I was learning, could be dangerous things. What if Daniel and Ashley never developed the maturity and gratitude that would make them worthy inheritors of substantial wealth? What if giving them access to my assets would actually harm them by removing the incentives for personal growth and financial responsibility? What if the most loving thing I could do for my family was to ensure they learned to value relationships over resources, character over comfort, integrity over inheritance? These were questions I'd never allowed myself to ask, but they were becoming impossible to ignore. I opened my laptop and began researching charitable foundations and educational institutions that might benefit from substantial endowments. I investigated trust structures that could provide for Daniel's basic needs while incentivizing responsible behavior and personal achievement. Most importantly, I started imagining a legacy that reflected my actual values, rather than my traditional assumptions about family obligations. For the first time in years, I felt like I was planning for a future that truly belonged to me. 3 months later, Ashley made her final mistake. She called me on a Tuesday morning, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, demanding that I come to their apartment immediately for what she called a necessary family discussion. When I arrived, I found Daniel pacing nervously while Ashley sat at their dining table surrounded by printed emails, bank statements, and what appeared to be real estate records. Her face was flushed with the particular fury that comes from discovering you've been outsmarted. "Sit down, Helen," she said without preamble. "We need to talk about your deception." I took the offered chair calmly, noting that neither of them had bothered with the usual pleasantries. This was clearly meant to be an ambush. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said evenly. Ashley slammed a piece of paper onto the table between us. It was a printout from the county assessor's website showing recent property transactions. My name appeared multiple times as both buyer and seller, with transaction amounts that told a very different story than the modest rental income they'd assumed I was earning. "This," Ashley said, pointing at the numbers with a trembling finger. 12 properties sold in the past 18 months. Total value, $4.7 million. $4.7 million, Helen, and that's just what we could find in public records. Daniel stopped pacing and stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It was the look of someone discovering that everything they thought they knew was wrong. "Mom," he said quietly, "is this real?" I glanced at the documents Ashley had compiled. She'd done thorough research. I had to give her credit for that. The information was accurate, though incomplete. She'd found records of my recent sales, but hadn't discovered the full extent of my holdings or my other investments. "Yes," I said simply. "Those transactions are real." The silence that followed was deafening. Ashley's mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice. "You've been lying to us for years," she whispered. "Years, Helen. While we've been struggling to pay for Ashley's education, while we've been living in this cramped apartment, while we've been grateful for your little handouts, you've been sitting on millions of dollars." "I've never lied to you," I corrected gently. "I simply haven't volunteered information you didn't ask for." Ashley shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the floor. "Don't you dare try to play word games with me. You knew exactly what we thought about your financial situation, and you let us believe it." "What did you think about my financial situation?" I asked with genuine curiosity. "We thought you were a struggling widow living on rental income from a few inherited properties," Daniel said, his voice hollow. "We thought you were stretching yourself financially to help us because you loved us." "I was helping you because I loved you," I said. "The extent of my financial resources doesn't change that." Ashley began pacing now, her movements sharp and agitated. "It changes everything. Do you have any idea how this makes us feel? We've been treating you like someone who needed our concern and protection, someone who might be financially vulnerable in her old age. Meanwhile, you've been playing some sick game, watching us worry about your security while you're worth more than most people see in a lifetime." "I've never asked you to worry about my security," I pointed out. "That's not the point," Ashley snapped. "The point is that you've been manipulating us, making us feel guilty for asking for help, making us jump through hoops to justify our needs, all while you could have solved our problems with pocket change." Daniel sat down heavily, still staring at the financial documents. "Mom, I don't understand. Why would you hide this from us?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been preparing to answer for months. "Because," I said carefully, "I wanted to understand who you really were before you knew who I really was." Ashley whirled around to face me. "Who we really were? What's that supposed to mean?" It means I wanted to see how you treated someone you perceived as having limited resources. I wanted to know whether your affection and respect were conditional on my ability to provide financial benefits. That's disgusting, Ashley said, her voice rising. You've been testing us like we're lab rats. I've been observing you like I'm a person whose feelings and dignity matter, I corrected. And what I observed was that you treated me very differently when you thought I was financially dependent than you would have if you'd known I was financially independent. Daniel looked up from the papers, his face pale. The photo session. That's when this all started, wasn't it? When Ashley said you couldn't be in the family pictures. That's when I realized, I agreed, that you'd already made decisions about my place in your family hierarchy. Decisions based on your assumptions about my value and status. Ashley's face was scarlet now. So you decided to punish us for one thoughtless moment? You've been playing games with our lives for months because of a photography session? I haven't been playing games, I said, firmly. I've been making careful decisions about how to handle a relationship where I was clearly not valued for who I am, but for what I could provide. What we could provide. Daniel's voice cracked. Mom, we love you. We've always loved you. Have you? I asked gently. Because for the past 3 years, every significant interaction we've had has involved you asking me for money. Every visit, every phone call, every family gathering has included some request for financial assistance. When was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? Daniel opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. Ashley had stopped pacing and was staring at me with something approaching hatred. We included you in our lives, Ashley said through gritted teeth. We invited you to dinners, to family events, to social gatherings. That counts for something. You invited me to events where you excluded me from family photographs because I didn't fit your aesthetic preferences, I reminded her. You included me in gatherings where you introduced me as someone who manages rental properties in a tone that made it clear you were embarrassed by my perceived status. I never said I was embarrassed, Ashley protested. You didn't have to say it. It was obvious in every interaction. The way you talked about my little business, the way you suggested I might be too old to handle property management, the way you assumed I needed your guidance to make financial decisions. I stood up and walked to their living room window, looking out at the landscaped courtyard of their expensive apartment complex. You see, I continued, when you thought I was a modest widow stretching to help you, you felt entitled to judge my choices and offer unsolicited advice about my finances. You felt comfortable suggesting that I was being unwise with my money when I hesitated to fund Ashley's MBA. You assumed that my reluctance was based on limited resources rather than legitimate questions about the value of the investment. Because that's what anyone would assume, Ashley said defensively. You were acting like someone who couldn't afford to be generous. I was acting like someone who wanted to understand what she was being asked to support, I corrected. But you interpreted reasonable questions as evidence of financial anxiety because you'd already decided I was someone whose resources were limited and whose judgment might be compromised by age. Daniel stood up and joined me at the window. Mom, if we misunderstood your situation, why didn't you just correct us? Why did you let it go on for so long? Because, I said, turning to face both of them, I was curious to see how deep the disrespect went. I wanted to understand whether you valued me as a person or as a resource. And what did you conclude? Ashley asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I concluded that you valued me as a resource, I said simply. A resource that you assumed would always be available to you, regardless of how you treated me. A resource that you felt entitled to judge and manage when it suited your purposes. Ashley sank back into her chair, her anger seeming to deflate into something more complex. So what now? She asked quietly. Are you going to cut us off completely? Is this your way of telling us that we're out of your will? This is my way of telling you that our relationship is going to change, I said. I'm no longer interested in being treated as a convenient bank that occasionally requires social interaction to maintain access. Daniel's face crumpled. Mom, we never thought of you that way. Didn't you? I asked. Then explain to me why every conversation about my money was framed in terms of investment in our future. Explain why you assumed my financial decisions should be made with your convenience in mind. Explain why you felt comfortable excluding me from family photographs while continuing to include me in your budget planning. Neither of them had an answer for that. I walked back to the table and picked up the financial documents Ashley had compiled. You did excellent research, I told her. Very thorough, but you only found about 30% of my actual holdings. Ashley's eyes widened. 30%? My total net worth is approximately $18 million, I said calmly. I own 63 properties across 3 counties, plus significant investments in stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. I generate more income in a month than most people make in a year. The numbers hit them like physical blows. Daniel actually staggered slightly, gripping the back of a chair for support. 18 million, he repeated numbly. 18 million. That I earned through careful planning, smart investments, and 25 years of hard work, I said. Money that I've been very generous in sharing with you, despite receiving very little appreciation or respect in return. Ashley was staring at me like I was a stranger. I don't understand. If you have that much money, why do you live so modestly? Why do you shop at discount stores and drive an old car and clip coupons? Because those habits helped me build wealth in the first place, I explained, and because I wanted to raise Daniel with normal values rather than the entitlement that often comes with knowing your family is wealthy. You wanted to raise him with normal values, Ashley repeated slowly. So you lied to him about who you were. I protected him from information that might have hindered his character development, I corrected. Unfortunately, it appears I may have protected him too well. Daniel was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he processed the magnitude of what he'd lost through his own short-sightedness. Mom, we can fix this, he said desperately. We can change how we interact. With you, we can show you the respect you deserve. Can you? I asked. Because respect that's motivated by knowledge of wealth isn't really respect. It's strategic self-interest disguised as affection. Ashley stood up abruptly. Fine. You win, Helen. You've successfully proven that we're terrible people who only cared about your money. Are you happy now? I'm not trying to prove you're terrible people, I said gently. I'm trying to help you understand that relationships require genuine mutual regard, not just convenient arrangements. So what do you want from us? Daniel asked. I want you to think carefully about what kind of people you want to be, I said. I want you to consider whether the values you've been demonstrating are the values you want to define your lives. I gathered my purse and prepared to leave. There's one more thing you should know, I said as I reached the door. The house you've been planning to inherit, the one you assumed would eventually be yours, I've decided to donate it to Habitat for Humanity, along with most of my other assets. The silence behind me was complete. I've established a charitable foundation that will distribute my wealth to organizations that support education, housing, and opportunities for people who work hard but lack resources. Daniel, you'll receive a trust fund that will provide for your basic needs, but it will be structured to encourage employment and responsible behavior rather than passive dependency. You're giving our inheritance away, Ashley whispered. I'm giving my money to people who will appreciate it, I corrected. People who understand the difference between entitlement and gratitude. I opened the door and paused for one final observation. Ashley, you were right about one thing. Family should support each other. But support flows both ways, and it includes emotional support, respect, and genuine care, not just financial transactions. When you're ready to offer that kind of support, we can talk about rebuilding our relationship. I left them sitting in their expensive apartment, surrounded by evidence of wealth they'd never bothered to understand, and opportunities they'd squandered through their own lack of vision. 6 months later, I received a handwritten letter from Daniel. It was thoughtful, introspective, and genuinely apologetic. He wrote about the therapy he'd been attending, the conversations he'd had with Ashley about their relationship patterns, and the changes they were both trying to make. He didn't ask for money. He didn't make excuses for their behavior. He simply acknowledged his mistakes and asked if there might be a path toward reconciliation. It was the first communication from him in years that focused entirely on emotional and relational concerns rather than financial ones. I wrote back, accepting his apology and inviting him to lunch. Just the two of us. No agenda beyond rebuilding a relationship that had been damaged by years of misplaced priorities. As for Ashley, she filed for divorce 3 months after our final confrontation. Apparently, learning that she'd married into a wealthy family and then lost access to that wealth through her own behavior was more than her ego could handle. Daniel was devastated by the divorce, but he handled it with more maturity than he'd shown in years. He didn't ask me to cover his legal fees or help him find a new apartment. He managed his own crisis, made his own decisions, and slowly began to rebuild his life based on his own efforts rather than external support. Today, Daniel and I have lunch once a month. We talk about his work, his hobbies, his goals, and his gradual recovery from a marriage that was built on the wrong foundation. He's dating someone new, a teacher who earns her own money and has never asked about my financial situation. The charitable foundation I established has funded scholarships for 37 students, built housing for 12 families, and supported numerous community organizations. Every quarterly report I receive reminds me that money used thoughtfully can change lives in ways that money spent carelessly never could. I still live modestly, still drive a practical car, still shop carefully. But now I do those things by choice rather than habit, and the difference in how that feels is profound. Marcus and I continue our friendship, which has evolved into something comfortable and companionable without being complicated by expectations or obligations. We attend concerts together, travel occasionally, and enjoy the kind of easy partnership that comes when two independent people choose to share experiences without needing to merge their lives completely. The professional photographs from that first session still hang in my living room, but now they're accompanied by pictures of scholarship recipients, new homeowners, and community volunteers whose lives have been touched by the foundation's work. Looking at those images, I see something I missed for years. The face of a woman who finally learned the difference between being generous and being used, between supporting family and enabling dysfunction, between loving unconditionally and allowing herself to be treated poorly in the name of family loyalty. It turns out that being locked out of family photographs was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to see myself clearly and to insist that others see me clearly, too. And in doing so, I discovered that the most important family portrait is the one you create by living authentically, surrounded by people who value you for who you are rather than what you can provide. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.